We're in something like a Cold War with China. And what Trump has done is to gut a lot of the energy industry, particularly in its clean energy modes. And this does terrible things to battery production, for example, which is one of the fields where we are competing with China.
Mm.
So it comes to be an extraordinarily ill-advised bill from the standpoint of the future. And it, I think, is likely to hurt the Donald Trump and the Republican coalition.
President Trump's one big, beautiful bill has officially passed just in time for Independence Day. Speaking at a rally in Iowa yesterday, the US president was enjoying the win.
There could be no better birthday present for America than the phenomenal victory we achieved just hours ago when Congress passed the one big, beautiful bill to make America great again. Right? Deport the illegals and slash hundreds of billions of dollars of waste and fraud, and that's what we're doing. With this bill, every major promise I made to the people of Iowa in 2024 became a promise kept.
Well, there you go. Geoff Kabaservice, author of Conservatism and the Republican Party, What Everyone Needs to Know, is on the line now. He's also Director of Political Studies at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. Good evening, Geoff.
Hi, Kathy. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much for coming on Times Radio. I mean, this is quite a win for Donald Trump, it has to be said. Really, can he do no wrong right now?
It's a big win for Trump, and it caps a series of victories he's had, which extend from Supreme Court decisions that have gone in his way to, of course, the results of the bombing campaign in Iran. But I question whether this actually will be good for Trump or the Republican Party in the long run, because really what it represents, this bill that he's passed, this enormous budget-busting budget bill, is something that actually is very much against the brand that he had promised to bring to the Republican Party. It is now a working class and, in fact, a multiracial, multi-ethnic working class party. But this is a bill that Paul Ryan would have happily passed. It basically balances the budget, or doesn't balance the budget, by giving handouts to the rich and inflicting penalties on the poor.
Yeah, so it's old-fashioned republicanism.
In many ways it is, but actually a more hard-hearted version and less fiscally responsible than most of the incarnations of the Republican Party that we've seen throughout history.
Yeah, because, I mean, what it will do for listeners who perhaps haven't tuned into events that side of the pond so closely, it will implement cuts to Medicaid, depriving millions of low-income and disabled Americans of their health care, and also depriving millions of low-income recipients of SNAP benefits, of help with their food costs. I mean, are you going to see here the richer Americans getting incredibly wealthy, more wealthy than they already are, and poorer Americans really heading into deprivation?
Well, you'll see the richest Americans get an enormous amount of pelf in their pockets as a result of this bill, no doubt about that. And some of it comes in somewhat obscure provisions like tax breaks for pass-through corporations, which are privately held and little known, but mostly which pertain to the top 1% of American earners. But there's no question that it will inflict severe hardships on some of those poor people you mentioned who rely on Medicaid services, especially, but also for people who rely or have come to expect cheap energy. Because one of the things that this bill does is revoke credits that have been extended in previous administrations for wind and solar power, which curiously are produced in the greatest numbers in many of the red states. So this will cost Donald Trump supporters not just jobs, but also higher electricity bills come the next winter.
Right. Well, that's interesting, because obviously a lot of Republicans, I don't want to be too cynical, but they might say, well, the Democrats have got to worry about the less well off and, we want to look after our own people. But what you're saying just there is that actually some of Trump's own supporters are going to feel the pain of this. And beyond that, the economic risk is huge, isn't it? You were talking about the budget busting nature of this bill. I mean, it will add $3.3 trillion to the deficit between now and 2034. I suppose the question is that going to come back to haunt Donald Trump after he's left office? So he might say, who cares?
Well, that estimate of 3.3 trillion, Kathy, by 2034 is actually an optimistic projection. It's actually likelier to cost in the nature of $5 trillion if certain provisions are extended. But, I think the issue here is partly one of hypocrisy in that the Republican Party has always campaigned as the dad party. Maybe a little boring, but fiscally responsible, good with numbers. Now it's just the who's your daddy partner. It's kind of gross and irresponsible. And Furthermore, we're actually right now speaking at a moment when we're in something like a Cold War with China. And what Trump has done is to gut a lot of the energy industry, particularly in its clean energy modes. And this does terrible things to battery production, for example, which is one of the fields where we are competing with China. So it seems to be an extraordinarily ill-advised bill from the standpoint of the future. And it, I think, is likely to hurt the Donald Trump and the Republican coalition.
Well, just to pin you down on that, because is there a sense that perhaps the sort of worst excesses of the bill will only come back to haunt Donald Trump long after he's left office, and so he's not going to feel the pain of it, or is what you're saying there that the voters who he's going to need, beyond the midterms at the next election, I'm assuming he gets to swing it that he runs another term, or at least one of his family or something like that. This is really they're going to feel the implications of this.
So a large part of what this bill does, of course, is to extend the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was the main legislative accomplishment of the first Trump term. And a lot of people liked that Trump economy. It ran hot on something of a sugar high as a result of that largely corporate-oriented tax cut. But that did trickle down into better employment prospects for people at the lower end of the spectrum. On the other hand, the economy simply is no longer now what it was in 2007 to 2018. We face much higher interest rates and borrowing costs. And curiously, although Republicans have long pushed for something called dynamic scoring for budget bills, which takes into account the growth impact that this bill will have, when you actually dynamically scored it, it actually cost more because it's going to have negative impact on interest rates, which will have ripple effects in all kinds of negative ways throughout the economy, as well as in the United States' ability to even repay its debts. And right now, we're actually paying as much in interest rates on the debt as we are for our entire national defense.
I mean, you've set out in very stark terms the damage this bill could do. I asked you right at the beginning, slightly tongue-in-cheek, I must admit, if Trump could do no wrong. But coming to the end of this interview, I wonder whether the real question is how the Republican Party has allowed him to get away with this.
Many Republicans in Congress voted for this bill with enormous trepidations. They know in their heart of hearts this isn't what they believe, that it's
So why didn't they stand up to him?
Because this is the nature of Donald Trump's party. He actually did display what we haven't really seen since Lyndon Johnson in terms of acute coalition management, able to cajole or bully his members into going along despite their better knowledge. Josh Hawley, Republican senator from Missouri, published an op-ed in the New York Times saying that this bill is going to be disastrous for Medicaid and therefore shouldn't be had. And he went along in the end, too.
Yeah, but he should be ashamed of himself then, shouldn't he?
Shame is not a capacity that the Republican Party seems to display in abundance these days, and neither is the ability to take a stand on principle. It's been a very disillusioning thing for a patriotic American and registered Republican, but that seems to be the way it is right now.
Geoff Kabaservice, fascinating to speak to you. Thanks very much for joining us here on Times Radio.